I instigate. I respond to situations the way I'm responding to a question. The thing has relevance only in terms of the fact that it is in response to a specific situation. It's not capable of being moved from that situation to another situation without being really altered by the change of condition. So therefore it counters the whole idea that art is a transcending power of some sort, that it can transcend time and culture and so on and so forth. What happens is a museum will ask me to come and spend some time in their situation, maybe do something. I go there, maybe spend a day, a week, or a month, or a year, trying to catch a feel of what goes on in that particular place. And I try and do something with that situation, leave as little trace of my own hand, as little identification of art as an actual singular event, and really, in a sense, try to alter how you perceive that situation in terms of reintroducing information which has previously been excluded. For example, you take the idea of an empty room. It means empty of something. But actually, on a perceptual level, that's not true. The room is full. If you were to take the number of elements or relationships that exist in the room and put them into a familiar metaphor, like a painting, you'd have a very complicated situation. And yet we've managed to, through a system of concepts on a hierarchical value structure, to decide that certain things are valuable and certain things are meaningless. So one of the reasons I think that contemporary art has gone through all the changes it has is to reintroduce all that information.
Robert Irwin is an artist, but also a kind of writer, philosopher, and teacher who is kind of one of the progenitors of a movement called the Light and Space movement, which came out of California in the mid-60s, and which really explored human perception. So how we interact with our environment, how the environment shapes us, and we in turn shape it. His work began with this kind of object-like exploration of these phenomena, using new materials, plastics, fabrics, and natural light, and then expanded towards more installation-like interventions into the actual architectural environments of the gallery. For example, at Dia Beacon, we have an installation, and it's just a piece of scrim that's pulled into a V and pulled across the gallery. And it gets filled with natural light from the clear story windows above so that it takes on a kind of different hue from the surrounding environment. And that filtration of light through the scrim creates this incredible feeling of fullness. And that's really characteristic of a lot of Irwin's work, that kind of almost impossible feeling of presence, even as the lightest touch is used.
Dia Beacon opened in 2003. It was the first time that people were really able to see Dia's collection, which had been established over, by that point, 3 decades, but had never been visible in the way that it could be here in its entirety. It's 300,000 square feet, allowing spaces to be established for individual artists so that you have this kind of sense of a practice unfolding or an immensity of a specific work. The story behind the discovery of the building is that Michael Govan, who was our then director at the time, and Lynn Cook, who was Dia's curator, really identified this building from an airplane. Michael Govan flies a small airplane and noticed this very large building adjacent to the Hudson River, also conveniently adjacent to the train station, and started to explore the possibility of what this site could be. Dia Beacon was originally a factory. It belonged to Nabisco. And Dia Beacon was the site for the box production. So not the biscuits, but the boxes. And it was a period of time when this area was part of the sort of industrial heartland, really, of New York State. So it was a very important site of production and obviously site of employment here that, like many other aspects of industrial life in the Northeast, suffered terribly leading into the sort of 1960s, 70s. And so by the time that the factory was selected as the site for Dia Beacon, it had been disused for many decades. The building was a semi-ruin with, vast open spaces which obviously needed articulating in some way. And the decision was made to bring in Robert Irwin. He'd made an incredible installation in Dia Chelsea in the late 1990s, and so was part of the kind of conversation at Dia, particularly around the time that this building was identified and the project was beginning. And so he was chosen to really work with the architects, open office, with the director, with the curator, and Len Riggio, president of the board at that moment, to envision how this building could be transformed into an art space.
I was kind of the overseer of the construction and also working with the artist and making these projects happen. When I walked in, I said, "You got to be kidding me." I said, this was bigger than anything we had ever done, and it was just a massive, massive project. And it was just, how were we going to do this? I mean, we weren't a big organization. They didn't want the project to be an architectural building. They wanted it to be kind of based on an artist. And Bob had that experience. And I mean, his phrase all the time was, the building's perfect. We just have to decide how not to f it up. And to tell you the truth, the building had the bones to be a Dia project. In the end, that was the main thing that drove it.
I started out essentially thinking about how and what it's like to come here. So I started really in my mind that the entrance to Dia was Grand Central Station. You get on the train and you watch the city slowly dissolve on the way up here, which is a kind of catharsis for somebody who never goes out of the city. And then finally you're alongside of the Hudson River, and during that period, someone from New York has a kind of, begin to get into a different state of mind, as it were. You get out, and there's a very scenic little harbor and this very scenic view, and you have a 7-minute walk to Dia, which is exactly right. So you walk up and then you arrive at the top of the hill, which now sets up everything.
Looking down at the side of Beacon, in fact, you can see the entire top of the building, which is quite spectacular, sort of beautiful sawtooth lights, which you then realize once you get in the building are what sort of brings this very specific quality to the Daylight Museum. But as you enter down into the space leading to Dia Beacon, you walk through what is in fact the car park. And maybe only a Californian artist would have thought of this, but you arrive in the car park and you're surrounded by a landscape that Bob has designed. So that entire kind of arrival area is in itself part of that experience. One of the primary concerns for Bob in articulating the landscape was color. The hawthorn trees that he selected have this incredible red berry in winter, which in fact lasts for many months, and a beautiful flowering blossom in the spring. So it creates a kind of very specific environment at different seasons of the year. And then the bosques, the trees that he selected for in front of the building and sort of parallel to one side of the building, are these types of trees that you can articulate in a very distinct geometry. So they've become sort of very much a kind of feature of Dia Beacon. The landscape is quite literally an artwork. Bob thinks of it as an artwork, and I think that's how people appreciate it when they visit. As you enter Dia Beacon, you come into what was in fact a newly created vestibule, which is what we're standing in here. You can tell that it's different in that he used a different type of brick and these sort of beautiful ways in which he played with the brickwork inside here. But it is also quite an enclosed space. It's a space that's naturally lit, as is the entire building. And the intention was very much to kind of bring you into this more darkened, perhaps more intimate environment, and then ultimately sort of choose your navigation through the site.
You could see all the way through the building to the back. So it was more about subtle directional thing. That's what Bob was always about, is about how do you get people to move.
There's no dictated route. It's not that you're following an art historical journey through time or space. It really is about respecting the individual bodies of work of the artist. So it's almost as if you have these individual museums or galleries dedicated to one singular voice, adjacent to each other and yet also separate from each other. Of course, what characterizes our collection is that most of these artists produced some of the most seminal work in the 1960s and 70s. So inevitably, of course, there are conversations across the artists who quite often knew each other, exhibited with each other, were in dialogue with each other. So there is a relationship between these bodies of work. A lot of museums, when we think about them, are actually vertical spaces, and so of course natural light is an unusual thing to have. But what characterizes Dia Beacon is this incredibly large footprint on the ground floor, which allows for a continuous natural light throughout the space. When Irwin was working on the landscape, he also conceived this enclosed garden that you can only really access from the galleries themselves. The garden, again, is very characteristic of Irwin's work, in that there's a very strong sense of geometry and symmetry. The plants that he chose similarly have this sort of changing color impact according to the different seasons. But I think the idea too was a sort of reference to the hortus conclusus, this idea of the closed garden, the kind of meditative space within the structure of the building itself, and a kind of quiet spot, I suppose, where you can step outside of the galleries and have a moment of respite. Irwin designed all of the entrances to Dia, so the gates here in the garden, but also the gates as you arrive at Dia Beacon. And the staircases are his design as well, this kind of waterfall effect of the stairs. Irwin had, a relatively light touch, but certain details are very striking, I would say very much related to his own practice as an artist as well, and one of which is the windows. Irwin made the decision to play with opacity and transparency. So you have these sort of beautiful areas where the glass is mottled and you have an impression of light in most seasons of the year, green, of course, from the environment around. And then these areas of total transparency where you have a very clear picture of the environment that surrounds the building and, of course, the sky, the time of day.
And I think that way of using the building itself to kind of mark the passage of time is incredibly beautiful and grounding. And I think speaks to the kind of enduring qualities of the work on view too. There's a kind of like slowness and a state of attention that it asks you to be with.
I think working with Bob, he taught me how to look at things a little differently, how to see subtle things that point us in directions that may not register in your head right away, but are just there, and all of a sudden you're following that path. It's kind of an amazing insight on how we perceive things, and he's a master of that.
I had talked in my writing, I talked a lot about the idea of a non-hierarchical space, the idea of no beginning, no middle, no end, and no charted way to proceed through it, but rather in a sense that every choice you make, you have to make at that moment. So I'd made a complete non-hierarchical space. What I liked about it was that after shooting my mouth off all those years, I had done it without actually knowing I'd done it. I had become it, which was very satisfying. And suddenly it's the way I looked at things, the way I saw.